그럼 지금부터 2020 한겨레
We will now begin the afternoon session of day 2 of the 2020 16th Hankyoreh-Busan International Symposium. And this session will proceed along the theme facilitating city diplomacy to strengthen Korea-ASEAN cooperation. Let me introduce the moderator for this session.
Hyuk from the ASEAN Korean Center. Please welcome him with a big round of applause. 네, 뜨거운 박수 부탁드리겠습니다.
Please welcome the Secretary General of the ASEAN Korea Center with a round of applause. And we also have with us His Excellency NGUYEN 부tung.
네, 뜨거운 박수 부탁드리겠습니다. 네, 감사합니다. 네, 1990년 3월부터 베트남 외교부에서 근무를 시작하셨고요. 베테랑 외교관이십니다. 네, 그러면 다음으로 한국 문화다양성기구 이사장.
And we also have with us Ms. Jasmine Lee, Executive Director of the Korea Cultural Diversity Organization and a former member of the National Assembly of Korea. And we also have with us an expert on the New Southern Policy, Mr. Xiwan Jin, Professor and Head of the Center for ASEAN-India Studies at the Korea National Diplomatic Academy. And we also have with us Professor Xiwan Jin of the Pusan National University. He is a rising current affairs critic. We will now begin session 4, and I'll hand over the floor to the moderator.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I'm Lee Hyuk, Secretary General of the ASEAN Korea Center. Let me briefly introduce our center to you. In the year 2009, there were various efforts to improve relations between Korea and ASEAN, and for that purpose, the ASEAN Korea Center was established under the support of the Korean government and ASEAN countries. So we are an international organization. We are engaging in various cultural, scholarly exchanges between Korea and ASEAN countries. Last year, we celebrated our 10th anniversary, and the ASEAN Korea Center has much plans and visions for the upcoming decade as well. We're gathered here at the APEC Nurimaru Conference Hall, and I personally think of this opportunity as being very significant. When I used to work for MOFAT as director of the Asia Pacific region, the Pusan APEC Summit was held back then, and this very conference hall, Nurimaru, was built for the sake of the APEC Summit in Busan. So ever since the summit was held, the relationship between Korea and ASEAN countries has deepened to a great extent. While entering this hall after all these years, I sincerely hoped that the relationship between Korea and ASEAN can leap forward and that we can overcome the COVID crisis. I hope that the citizens of Busan will also provide their support towards this goal. The relationship between ASEAN and Korea, yes, we have seen much progress. ASEAN is Korea's number 2 trading partner after China, and it is Korea's 3rd largest investment destination. And as the ASEAN area is also where many Korean people go as tourists. If the COVID crisis is over, I'm sure that you all have plans to travel overseas, and I'm quite certain that many Koreans would opt to visit ASEAN countries like the Philippines, Vietnam, and Thailand. So the the 10 countries and Korea, we have become ever more close. At our center, and also the Korean government has given much thought on how to improve Korea-ASEAN relations, and we have decided to connect people and increase people-to-people exchanges and also share prosperity and develop and grow together. That has been our slogan for the Korea-ASEAN relationship, and our center also shares that vision and goal. The Hankyoreh media has prepared this excellent international symposium at a time when we are challenged indeed. So I want to thank Hankyoreh for their efforts and for putting together this symposium. My thanks especially goes to the Hankyoreh Foundation for Reunification and Culture. And the Busan Metropolitan has also provided utmost support. So I thank the city as well. The theme for this session is facilitating city diplomacy for strengthening Korea-ASEAN cooperation. But I don't think we need to confine our discussions to this topic only because we have various and distinguished discussants here with us, including Ambassador Yuan Butung, Executive Director Jasmine Lee, Professor Choe, and Professor Xiwan Jin, all very distinguished figures. I hope we can engage in discussions on various topics. Anything that crosses your mind with regard to the Korea-ASEAN relationship, please feel free to express them to us. Having said that, city diplomacy is the key word for session 4. Last year's moderator pointed out that the special Korea-ASEAN 25th summit was held in Pusan, followed by another round of summit. What this means is that the relationship between Korea and ASEAN is not only important, but the city of Busan is serving as a very important hub. The special summit in itself does not automatically make Busan a hub city. I think Busan can be called a hub city because it is engaged in various areas like investment, trade, and people-to-people exchanges, and the ASEAN community. Because the Korea-ASEAN relationship has evolved, and because the relationship between Busan and ASEAN has evolved on all these fronts that I just mentioned, I believe that is what has made Busan a hub city indeed. And I am extremely glad and happy to be a part of today's symposium that is held in this very important city of Busan. And once again, Busan is given a great opportunity to once again reaffirm its status as the hub city. And I hope that myself and the citizens of Busan can give much thought to how we can better improve Korea-ASEAN relations. With that, I would like to now invite our discussants. The first is Ambassador Yuan Butung, Vietnam Ambassador to Korea.
I used to work as the ambassador of Korea to Vietnam. And under the Foreign Affairs Ministry, Foreign Ministry of Vietnam, there is an academy, a diplomatic academy, and the ambassador Nguyen Butong used to be the director of that academy. So I met him there. So he has had an excellent track record, both as a scholar and as a diplomat. So he has both practical as well as academic experience in diplomatic affairs. So I have great faith in his capabilities. Currently, Vietnam is the chair of the ASEAN summit. ASEAN, there are 10 countries. And it was Vietnam's turn this year to be the chair country of ASEAN. And currently, the ASEAN summit is being held in Hanoi. And online, the Korea's ASEAN summit is also being held online right now. And so, of course, President Moon Jae-in is attending that Korea-ASEAN summit. So, His Excellency Ambassador Nguyen Butong will be talking about the ASEAN summit and the position and status of Korea in the ASEAN countries, and also Vietnam's vision regarding ASEAN. So, Your Excellency, please go ahead.
Thank you, Ambassador Lee. Do you hear me? Okay, thank you. First of all, let me thank the Hungary Foundation for inviting me. To this annual forum, and I think that it is a very good chance for me to be in Busan. It is my very first visit to Busan, and I think it will not be the last one. I will be visiting the city more. I promise to myself at least. Also, thank Ambassador Lee for inviting me to this panel where I can share my views on the ASEAN relations with Korea and Vietnam. The role of Vietnam in promoting this relationship at both bilateral and regional level. My presentation on how Vietnam contributes to the promotion of ASEAN as the driving force in the region, and how Vietnam contributes to the promotion of ASEAN-Korea relation is mentioned in the booklet, and I think that you can have the opportunity to look at it and use it for later time. I would like to focus my presentation on more specifically about the theme of our panel, which is city diplomacy. And I would make two major points. Point number one is my discussion on the context where the new Southern policy is implemented. And the second major point is about how we can do in order to promote city-to-city diplomacy. We all know that the new Southern policy introduced by Moon Jae-in government is a very important diplomatic initiative from the part of South Korea, and this initiative has been warmly welcomed by all the ASEAN members. And we are now talking even about the new stage of the New Southern Policy, and the term here is New Southern Policy 2.0. So what is important in my view about the New Southern Policy is that it has been entering the new phase, which is the implementation phase. We are more familiar with the ASEAN Summit with Korea that took place here about 1 year ago in Pusan. And it is also about the summit, the Korean Mekong Summit that also took place here, and we are celebrating the first anniversary, and I think next week. So we are familiar with the agreements on the action plans that all of the concerned parties would take in order to bring the political will into the actions, the concrete actions. And we are all familiar with the major themes that are peace, prosperity, and people. So I think that we have achieved quite a lot. Within a year, we have raised the awareness of all the party concerns about how the New Southern Policy is important to the countries in ASEAN region and to Korea. And now we are entering the second phase. And the second phase is even more, of course, more important than the first phase, because we all want to see the concrete outcomes, concrete results of the announced policies along the three pillars of peace, prosperity, and people. And we face a new context. We face a new context that I think making the implementation phase a little bit more difficult than the first one. And it is natural, because when we roll the sleeve and then we get into the actual action, then we face with obstacles and difficulties. And I think that, again, it is natural, it is normal in order to get things done. We have three type of new context here. One is ASEAN Way. I think the ASEAN Way is somehow still new to the Korean partner. ASEAN is moving in a gradual and slow way, and the decision made by consensus and by informal meetings rather than by public announcement and open events that every can see. So this is slowing down the process a bit, and I think that ASEAN is for quite a long time now has been criticized by that, but I think that there are some merits in the gradualism, but of course there are some things that we can improve the ASEAN Way. But the bottom line is it takes time, and we should be patient on the way we get the outcomes or get things done. Secondly, when it comes to the specific partners and actors that are implementing, that are translating the agreements into specific projects, we have the people that are having specific interest. We have business circles that are also having business interest here, and then we have a host of different interest different partners and actors with different interests, and that would also take place for the agreement to be reached. Then we have COVID. COVID-19 is the very special situation when we don't have normal transaction like before. We have the flights that have been canceled. We have the quarantine procedures that prevent people from even thinking of moving, from going overseas. And then we have the strict measures that slow down and that even blunts the efforts for people to get out of the country to be in the foreign land to do projects. So I think that we are having more obstacles when we enter the second phase of implementing the New Southern policy, or the higher stage of promoting cooperation between us. But we have to move to go ahead. We have to move forward, thinking of the better time when we can be back to normal. So it is the very good time for us to stop and think of a more practical and more suitable ways to get things done. And I think, that is the pathway for me to the second part of my presentation, which is the city-to-city diplomacy. I think that it is a very promising way for us to develop the relationship, and I think that it would be something like a contrast from the first phase. The first phase, which is top down, and I think when we enter the second phase, the bottom up approach might be more suitable, and I try to explain why. Reason number one is that we address the specific question. We addressed the specific type of interest, and we attend to the specific actors, the actual actors that are working on the field. So, for example, the city-to-city diplomacy would take forms of the sistership, and I think that this the practice of seeking sistership relationship has been here for some time. We have witnessed the sistership relationship between provinces to provinces, city to cities, and that is the very good place for us to start. Reason number two is that we have some thing to start. We don't start from scratches. We have sistership already, and then we have the context already, and then we have the ongoing projects already, and that is the place for us to continue the ongoing projects. And then when we have the outcome from specific projects, we have the confidence, and then we have the habit, and then the mechanism for further cooperation. And the cooperation that is successful in one area can be easily translated into other area, or from the same area we can go deeper into the more intensified or more institutionalized type of cooperation. So I think that if we promote the city-to-city diplomacy, we have more conditions to translate the planned actions into concrete project, and then we good outcome. The third reason is that from the bottom-up approach is more manageable and is more it is easier to check the outcome, to have the scorecard of the cooperation. So I think that what we can do in order to promote the city-to-city relationship is that we can show to the party concerned of what we can achieve. And here are some areas that I think we can do. And I'm so lucky to have my 2 last days spent in Jeju. And I can have the first experience on how city-to-city cooperation can proceed. One is the marriage. We have about 500 Vietnamese brides in Jeju, and other countries also have women marrying to Korean men in Jeju. And this is, I think, very easy for the women to connect to their hometown. They are real diplomats at the grassroots level, and they can introduce to the city where they came from, to the province where they came from, to the place where they are residing now. Secondly, workers, the workers from abroad can also become the agents for improvement of promotion of relationship. Take the case of Vietnam again. At Jeju, we have about 800 workers, and they are highly valued by the employers in Jeju, and they are contributing to the prosperity of the products that Jeju is producing. And these products are finding their ways to the Vietnamese market. And look what happened. When they are sold in Vietnam, the revenue can be contributed to the trade volume between the two countries. And that is the bottom-up, very bottom-up approach where the actual people in the actual provinces or cities can contribute to the cooperation between the two countries. That seems to be abstract. So the abstract things can become more actual and become more practical, and people can see that. And last, cities can become the production site for investment. So cities in Vietnam, for example, can be hosting Korean investment projects, like it is happening now in Vietnam and other Southeast Asian countries. So in short, from interpeople relation, from the working and trading relation, and from investment relations, cities can contribute to the promotion of cooperation at the national level. And I think that when we enter the second phase of cooperation, the meeting point here is where the bottom-up approach can meet the top-down approach. And I am ending my presentation with the hopeful remark that we can do so many things in order to promote cities-to-city cooperation. And last but not least, Ambassador Lee just told the audience that I came from an academic background, and it is for me for the very first time to see how diplomacy can work in the practical and real conditions. And I'm so happy to present my embassy to contribute to that process. Thank you very much for your attention.
tung 대사님 정말 좋은 말씀 감사합니다.
Thank you very much for your insightful words. The Moon Jae-in government has proclaimed the new Southern policy, and the 2.5 version of the new Southern policy has been disclosed. The phase 2 of the Southern policy means that we will carry out and implement what we have proclaimed, and city to city level cooperation becomes ever more important. And it has to be a bottom up process rather than being a top down process, so that various citizens can cooperate and come up with substantial results. As a matter of fact, the city of Busan has a sister city relationship with Ho Chi Minh City. And the city of Busan, from a geographical point of view, is able to establish good ties with various cities around the world. And in that respect, city to city level exchanges will be very important in achieving the goals of the new Southern policy. So thank you very much, Ambassador, for your words, and I entirely agree to your comments. Entirely agree with your comments. Next, we would like to invite Executive Director Jasmine Lee. As you are probably well aware, she was the former member of the 19th National Assembly of the Republic of Korea. She has married a Korean, and she has lived in Korea for decades now, I believe. I personally was serving as Korea's ambassador to the Philippines, and that's when she became the National Assembly member. President Aquino awarded her as a prestigious Filipina, and I have met her mother and grandmother as well. So we are quite close, and multicultural family members and foreign migrants to Korea. She has made much efforts to improve their rights and their situation. The Korean society tends to be quite conservative, and those can be called some of the challenges that migrants face. So she has provided very clear and solid visions for Korea in terms of improving migrants' rights in Korea. So I would like to now give the floor to Jasmine Lee. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Very nice to meet you. Listening to what was spoken yesterday, I feel that the focus is not so much on the pandemic, but on the U.S. presidential elections. A lot of talk has been exchanged on U.S. elections yesterday. So in May of this year, according to the results of the Pew Research Center, it stated that in the year 2055, the number of Asian American voters will outnumber Hispanic voters. And even during this year's U.S. presidential elections, Asian Americans were accounted for a huge number of voters. And a lot of them were naturalized citizens. 85% of Asian Americans come from 6 countries. The majority of them come from 6 countries. Number 1, China. Number 2, the Philippines. Number 3, India, Vietnam, Korea, and Japan. And these 6 countries, yes. So in the year 2055, like I pointed out, the proportion of Asian Americans in the US will increase. And it would be quite interesting to see how things change in the future. Of course, the number of migrant voters and naturalized Korean voters in Korea are quite few at the moment. But I think we will continue to see reports and statistics on the results and the changes. Unlike the United States, family immigration is not possible in Korea, which is why the number of migrants will not soar in Korea for the time being. The current Korean government is pushing ahead with the new Southern policy, placing much emphasis on it. So this new Southern policy, as was already mentioned, has three main pillars: peace, prosperity, and people. The first pillar is people. So I want to talk about the migrants and multicultural families in Korea and how they can contribute to improving the relations between Korea and ASEAN. The United States is constantly stating that it will place importance on its ally relationships. As for Korea, early this year, you probably heard how the number of migrants surpassed 2.5 million. 25 million. So the number of naturalized people is over 300. So it stands somewhere a little bit slightly below 5% of the entire Korean population. Usually when the proportion reaches about 5%, that country is called a multicultural society. Among the 2.5 million, most of them are from ASEAN countries. And there are over 1 million members that are a part of multilateral families, and these people are also, a lot of them are from ASEAN countries. Thanks to the ASEAN Korea Center, I received much important data on this.
10년 이상
Those who have dwelled in Korea for over 10 years, 60% of migrants were found to have lived in Korea for 10 years. So they are already past the initial adjustment phase. They have found jobs and they have to engage in social activities, and their contribution to society is growing because they have stayed in Korea for quite an amount of time. Like I said, family immigration is not legally accepted in Korea. So those who migrate through marriage are maintaining close ties with their families in their home countries. So whenever they have information about Korea, they would relay the information to their friends and family members in their country. The news goes even rapidly than what you see on the media reports. And the SNS platform is also very rapid in delivering news and information. The number of hours that people spend in SNS and internet is over 1 hour longer than the global average. The reason for this is because a lot of Southeast Asians have their family members abroad, which is why SNS becomes a very important platform for them. The number of students or children is about 140,000. 60% of them are preschoolers within the framework of multicultural families in Korea. So, not many multicultural family members are eligible for voting, but if you have permanent residency, you can cast your vote for general local elections. So the so-called local elections, if you want to win votes, yes, because they have voting rights for local elections, we might want to remember that fact. Those who have migrated through marriage and the female migrants are serving as important bridges linking cities with each other. Like the ambassador said, it is a bottom-up process. Yes. The migrants will be initiating and improving the relationship between and among countries, and I believe they will become ever more active in the future. Already you can find migrants who are serving as bridges and mediators for creating more sister city relationships between Korea and ASEAN countries. And people like myself who have lived in Korea for a long time, we begin to work in various sectors of society. Of course, the Korea Cultural Diversity Center and interpreting and translating probably may be the only job that comes to your mind. But I became a politician. Some decide to become public servants, professors, and nurses. A lot of migrants are working as nurses in Korea after passing the examination. So, a lot of migrants are establishing their social status here in Korea. And whenever a certain kind of problem or conflict occurs between two countries, or if any kind of natural disasters occur, the migrants join hands with Korean citizens, and they join hands to solve those issues. And you will see more of that happening in the future. As the ambassador pointed out, there are migrants who can link cities. The North Gyeongsang province has a project called Global Lidi. As you're well aware, ASEAN is Korea's number 2 trading partner, which is why the role of migrants are very important because they understand the culture and they're very fluent in the languages. For this reason, they are able to serve the role as diplomats in a sense.
트레이닝을 하고 있습니다. 그러니까 양국 간의 공조를 할 수 있도록 문화하고 언어.
They're able to link the cultures of both sides. And a lot of local autonomous bodies and migrant-related organizations, if they will continue to contribute to development of the mutual relationship on these areas. Last but not least, children of migrants are growing up and entering society. A lot of them, for instance, have joined the military. This year marks the 10th year where migrants' children have joined the have been receiving and going through mandatory military service. So their children will also join their parents' efforts and serving as diplomats linking Korea and ASEAN. The three female migrants that I mentioned, one of them is a very famous musical performer. And then there's Pia B, very well known for billiard. So I'm sure that we will begin to see them officially become diplomats in Korea. Thank you very much. Because of time constraints, I asked her to be as brief as possible, and I apologize for that. I'm sure you have so much more to say. She talked about multicultural families and how 37% of them come from ASEAN countries. So the issue of multicultural families. Well, foreigners account for 5% of the entire Korean population today. So the term multicultural family, I think, will soon have to disappear actually, because any kind of family in Korea are Korean families, are they not? They are living and coexisting in Korea with all of us, which is why I personally don't really prefer using the term multicultural family. I hope to see that term disappear and that we can send the message that Korea is very open and acceptive towards foreigners. And I'm sure that that day will come indeed. Thank you very much for your comments, Jasmine Lee. Next, we would like to invite Professor Won-gi Choe.
Professor Xiwan Jin will be focusing more on the New Southern Policy and take a strategic approach in talking about the New Southern Policy. We are restricting the discussants' comments to 7 minutes, so please keep to that rule. Yes, thank you. I'm Chae Gi. I'm working at the Korea National Diplomatic Academy, and we are currently researching the New Southern Policy. Thank you very much for inviting me. I have 4 points to make. First of all, the aim and significance of the New Southern Policy. And secondly, I would like to assess the outcome or achievements of this New Southern Policy, which was announced about 3 years ago in 2017. And thirdly, I'd like to talk about the future of the New Southern Policy. Currently, the ASEAN-Korea Summit is being held online. If the coronavirus, if not for the pandemic, I believe that President Moon Jae-in would have flown to Vietnam, to Hanoi for this meeting, but he will be holding this meeting, participating in this meeting online, probably this afternoon. And he will be also including in his presentation or speech the future direction of the New Southern Policy. So he will be calling it the New Southern Policy Plus. So he will be talking about the future direction of the New Southern Policy. So I will be sharing with you my thoughts on that. And lastly, Since the topic of this session is the New Southern Policy and also city diplomacy, I will share with you my thoughts on that as well. First of all, the aim and significance of the New Southern Policy. I have mentioned this on several occasions, but to sum it up again, the New Southern Policy is symbolic of the economic as well as diplomatic diversification that the South Korean government is going for, is aiming for. And the subject of or target of this kind of new diversification policy would be Southeast Asian countries, ASEAN countries. ASEAN countries, right after China, have become important partners, trading partners for Korea, and about a few years ago, and ASEAN countries are growing economically by leaps and bounds. And just a few years ago, the Korea GDP was as big as all the ASEAN countries' GDP put together. But now, all the countries are growing in ASEAN, and now Korea is suffering from low growth at the moment, but the dynamism and driving force is very much alive in ASEAN countries. And they're still growing rapidly, and they will become the center and the engine for the global economy. So, diversifying our economic as well as diplomatic policies vis-a-vis ASEAN will be a win-win strategy. And also, diplomatic diversification is very, very important. We have the East Asian Summit that we hold annually, not only between Korea, China, and Japan, but other countries will come together. So ASEAN has become the hub for the summit, the gathering place for the leaders of many countries, including countries like New Zealand, Australia, the United States. They will all come together during the ASEAN summit. So the ASEAN region has become a gathering place for world leaders. So we not only need to focus on economic diversification, but also diplomatic diversification. And that sums up what the New Southern Policy is all about. So for the past 3 years, the South Korean government has been very active in pushing ahead with the New Southern Policy, and it has achieved quite a great deal. So it is not top down but bottom up, and it is led. A lot of the initiative is led by business leaders, by businesses. I think about 10,000 Korean companies are already doing business in Vietnam, and they were succeeding. And thanks to the New Southern Policy, the government is strengthening cooperation in order to enhance the environment for Korean businesses to do business in the ASEAN countries. And so it's not only big businesses, but small and medium-sized enterprises that are finding it much easier to do business in ASEAN countries. I think it was back in 2018. And I read some Chinese data. There are about 20,000, almost close to 30,000 Korean companies doing business in China. So it has been decreased by about half. And a lot of these companies have shifted to ASEAN countries. And Korean tourists, their most frequent destination are in ASEAN. And Vietnam, Da Nang in Vietnam is a favorite destination for Korean tourists, and now we even have a mission there. And from on the diplomatic front, there is a bureau in the Foreign Ministry of Korea where that is dedicated to ASEAN. And in Jakarta, we have the mission of the Republic of Korea to ASEAN, and the position and status of this mission has been raised. And so the personnel has been increased by about threefold, and the head of this mission has been promoted to vice ministerial level. There has been 27 rounds of visits in the past 3 years by the president to ASEAN countries or in ASEAN related meetings. That's how active and aggressive the South Korean government is in pushing ahead with the New Southern policy, and how important the South Korean government thinks of its relation with ASEAN. And actually, we have a common interest. ASEAN and Korea has common interest in promoting open regional cooperation in this region rather than competing. So there is a lot of room for cooperation, regional cooperation to grow. And regarding the future of the New Southern policy, which will be announced by President Moon Jae-in this afternoon, so I'm not sure, I'm not very well versed in the details, but what I can say for now is that in the future we need to promote and strengthen strategic cooperation so that it is a win-win situation, a mutually beneficiary cooperation and relationship within this region, in the face of rivalry between the U.S. and China. And secondly, I think in the future, the New Southern policy should focus on cooperation in the health sector, in the medical sector, in the face of the pandemic. And right now, we are facing economic downturn because of the COVID, and so we need to strengthen reciprocal or mutually beneficiary economic cooperation. And Southeast Asian countries, including China, so there were 16 Southeast Asian countries that came together, and now China has dropped out, and we are joined by New Zealand and some other countries, and we need to strengthen such regional cooperation, and with ASEAN as the center, we need to reach out to the rest of the world together. And lastly, I think the city diplomacy, which Pusan is spearheading, is very important in the context of the New Southern policy. So South Korea, it's not traditionally or strategically located to be a maritime power, but most of the external policies and are taking place through the sea because we are blocked from the continent by North Korea. So the national strategy, this New Southern policy can be a national strategy for national growth And Pusan can be a great initiator and take the initiative through city diplomacy. So I think Pusan has a great opportunity here. Thank you very much.
You have talked about the New Southern Policy and the New Southern Policy Plus. At the Korea-ASEAN Summit, President Moon is soon to disclose the New Southern Policy Plus and its content. And as Professor Choe has pointed out, cooperating on education and healthcare and human development becomes very important, especially in the face of COVID-19. At any rate, the relationship between Korea and ASEAN, unlike Korea's relationship with countries like China, US, and Japan, it is a relationship that is ever growing. And it is quite beneficial to each other, which is why under the New Southern Policy and also with the support of other important concepts and initiatives, I think we have limitless room for further progress. City-to-city cooperation is also an important pillar of Korea's New Southern Policy. Because the city of Busan has many geographical merits, I sincerely hope that Pusan will continue to exert efforts and put in ideas for the sake of improving Korea-ASEAN relations. And the ASEAN-Korea Center will also seek the support of the Korean government. Last but not least, let us invite Professor Xiwan Jin. From what I understand, Professor Jin is a very well-known figure in the city of Pusan. Professor Jin often talks about the international status of Pusan, the concepts of megacity and related initiatives. He is a great supporter of such initiatives, and he provides logical grounds for such initiatives. So Professor Jin, the relationship between Korean ASEAN and Busan's role in the relationship and how Busan can further strengthen its cooperation with ASEAN countries are the topics that he will deal with. Professor Jin, please. Very nice to meet you all. Let me share some interesting stories since it's afternoon time. Yesterday and this morning, I heard very interesting comments about security and diplomacy. And many people were talking about the COVID-19 situation and President Trump's defeat in the elections and how the environment will change in the future in terms of security and diplomacy and how the relationship between China and the US will evolve and so forth. Many experts have shared their views on these topics. Well, in talking about city diplomacy, I question whether the nation-centered approach and the framework of diplomacy and security is really valid. Of course, they are very important, but I think we also have to remember that citizens have to lead their everyday and normal lives. So, putting everything in the framework of a nation-centered mindset, and if we try to instill that too much to the minds of the citizens, then what happens is that, for instance, when Korea and Japan's relations deteriorates, then people-to-people exchanges are severed all of a sudden as well. It's quite unfortunate to see that happen. So when we are trying to discuss the topic of city diplomacy, I think we have to take a step away from the so-called high politics. What I mean to say is that regardless of the relationship between countries and regardless of the ideology that countries accept, even if there is conflict between countries, even if all of this happens, I think that ordinary citizens should be able to still exchange with one another, enjoy time together, be able to travel and have conversation and smile and laugh with one another. That kind of space is necessary, and that space, creating that kind of space, is the very goal of steady diplomacy. So, steady diplomacy is about a bottom up approach. It is about a very liberal approach taken by citizens themselves. President Trump has defeated in the election, and he has created a not so much optimal environment around the world. Multilateralism has weakened, and democratic values and human rights have weakened as well. Because we are awaiting a very rational President elect Biden to take office, I think we pin much hopes on the upcoming US president. Pfizer is announcing that it now has vaccines for COVID as well, which is also very positive. So I wish to see a corona-free world unfold in front of us. Why is city diplomacy important? We talk about globalization, localization, but all of this is not being facilitated ever since the coronavirus hit hard. The economy around the world and the security environment is also deteriorating. Conflict between US and China is cutthroat, and possibility of North Korea provoking is also increasing. I think there is high possibility that North Korea will engage in another round of missile tests. So against this backdrop, globalization is weakening and individual nations are being strengthened and multilateralism is losing ground. But what is positive among all this is that cities are growing and growing. The same can be said for Seoul and the Pusan metropolitan city and cities like Shanghai. Regionalism and globalism is being challenged, but we continue to see the creation of megacities, and 50% of the global population are dwelling in cities. So, city can be a very important criterion or pillar for thinking of ways to facilitate diplomacy on the level of citizens. If you look at page 9, you see how the government established a balanced development committee, and it has divided Korea into 9 administrative districts. For instance, Daegu, Gyeongbuk, Jeonnam can be separate groupings, and various projects are currently underway. So the south and east bounded together would mean a 8 million population. We are talking about balanced growth nationwide. This is very important for people living outside of Seoul. We cannot survive with the strength of local governments alone, which is why enlarging our cities becomes very important. The Bulgyeong Megacity project is there, and many research centers are preparing for this project. What is missing in the project has to do with city diplomacy with foreign megacities. Whenever I meet public officials working for local governments, I always suggest this idea of cooperating with megacities overseas. and how they should further strengthen cooperation with foreign megacities. Actually, Busan is already on that path, and the Bulgyeong Megacity project is among Busan City's three main priorities for 2021. We often talk about the new southern policy and the new northern policy and how Busan is the hub city. Is there any substance to it actually? Because everything is soul centered in Korea, is it not? So even if we pursue megacities, I think we also have to consider exchanging and cooperating with megacities and megacity citizens of nearby countries. If you look at page 80, as the ambassador has pointed out, Busan City has made a committee to work on this very topic. Of course, because of COVID-19, we're actually not able to convene meetings face to face. Everything is proceeding online. At any rate, what can Busan do to become a hub city for city diplomacy? Hub city should not become a mere rhetoric. The beginning and end of the New Southern Policy is Busan. We hear this kind of slogan quite a lot, but it should not remain as mere rhetoric. The politicians should come up with clear commitments and what they mean when they recognize Busan as a hub city under the new Southern policy. Busan should indeed become a hub city, not just called one. And otherwise, Seoul will remain and continue to serve as the hub city for city diplomacy in Korea. And Busan will once again be pushed to the peripheries, and we don't want to see that happen, which is why I want the government and politicians to come with more solid content. And then there are our neighboring countries like Japan. Kyushu is there, Fukuoka is there, and there are many megacities in ASEAN region, and then there's Shanghai and Qingdao in China. So cooperating and exchanging with these megacities would be a good idea for Busan, as I see it. I think we have to be a fast and first mover in doing that. Of course, we have a committee in place, but again, I think we have to move rapidly. I keep mentioning Seoul. I hope it makes some concessions and gives more opportunity to Busan cities. When we talk about new southern policy or new northern policy, if everything and every opportunity is given to Seoul, then what happens to a city like ours? So I hope the central government can ponder on what it can do. And the Busan metropolitan city should not focus on events when it talks about city diplomacy. There should be cultural exchanges on the citizens' level. Many writers, poets visit ASEAN countries quite a bit. So if these kind of exchanges can happen at the city level, that would be very desirable. Of course, at the national level, there has to be much thought on security and diplomacy. But again, citizens are having to lead an everyday life, and they should be given the opportunity to exchange with ASEAN, have exchanges with ASEAN. And one thing that I would like to suggest to Busan City is to take a creative and proactive approach. Instead of waiting for what is decided by the government or the Central Research Institute, it can come up with creative ideas of its own. When we talk about city diplomacy and when we talk about our relationship with ASEAN and strengthening that relationship, um, and in order to facilitate city diplomacy, I think decentralization is very important. We haven't been able to revise our constitution on that. But I think we have to continue to push ahead so that decentralization in its strict sense can become a reality. Independent local governments should be in place in Korea. Even when Korea-Japan relations are deteriorating, many people still visit the Tema Island to go fishing. So I think we should look at city diplomacy in this latter frame. We have to move away from country to country diplomatic level approaches and focus more on citizen to citizen level exchanges. And I think that should be the focus of metropolitan cities. Even when we talk about giving visa exemptions, I think local governments should be given the authority and right to do that. I'd like to conclude with that. Thank you very much. Professor Jin, thank you very much for your words. I very much agree to what you have pointed out, and I believe that the citizens of Busan and the people of Korea would heed his comments. Oftentimes, when government to government relationships go sour, it directly affects the relationship between citizens and people of those countries. And that really helps no one, and it definitely does not help the economy. It doesn't help diplomacy either. I have been involved in Korea-Japan relations for quite a long time, and whenever the relationship deteriorates, the number of tourists decreases almost instantly. So we may want to rethink how to solve that phenomenon. Actually, when relationships with Japan deteriorates, we have to work even more on facilitating cooperation and exchange on the citizen level.
And Professor Jin has been talking about city diplomacy and its importance. And he has given examples of how many Asians, especially Koreans, live in the United States, big cities in the United States. And so mega cities are leading national growth and national progress, and that is a phenomenon that we cannot deny, or it's an inevitable phenomenon that we should take advantage of. So he has pointed out something very important, because when we practice city diplomacy, what we are looking at is the potential, the growth potential of that city. That is the criteria that we have when we decide whether to have a sister relationship with that city or not. And so that is the cold reality. If there is nothing that Busan can give, then megacities around the world will not want to become a sister city of Busan, and vice versa. But when we look at Hanoi, for example, do you know how big Hanoi is? It's 3,300 square kilometers. It's a big city. It's bigger than Seoul in terms of land size. And so growing these sister relationships from city to city, that will be a plus for bilateral relations between our two countries. It's the same for Tokyo. So agglomeration and also heightening density of the cities is a trend that we cannot reverse, and we should ride that trend and harness that trend. And as you know, states, they exist for the people, and it is for the people's happiness that states exist. So that is the raison d'être of countries. So I hope that the citizens will agree with me in also cooperating and also going for such city diplomacy. We have about 20 minutes left. So rather than trying to lead a discussion in this very short period of time, I'd like to give that 20 minutes to each of the discussants, starting with Ambassador Tung.
If you want to say something now, maybe 5 minutes.
I'll go a little bit deeper on the point of how we can facilitate the sistership relationship. And we all listening to the other panelists, I would think that we need to have something done at the grassroots level, and the sistership relationship is the way, possible way to start things up. So we would think of 3 ways where we can bring cities together. One is from the administrative perspective. 2 is from the production perspective. And 3 is from the people perspective. And I will go into each of them. From the administrative perspective, I think that the cities are having the same problems. And I think that sharing the experience and building the capacity of the city governments are very important. So we can work together on, say, smart city, community building, and development of the welfare system to benefit the people living in the cities. So we all know that the smart city is now a very common theme that many cities are talking about. So what would the cities can work together in order to share the experience on the concept, on the actual development of smart city is very important, and cities can find partners working on that. So the city governments can find partners from elsewhere, from abroad, to see how the common problems are solved outside their own area of authority. Community building also a very important theme. So welfare, development of welfare system, COVID-19 is the big problem. And the way different cities are coping with this COVID-19 tells a very vivid story that cities efficient and committed with efficient and committed officials can make a difference. And at the national level, COVID-19 cooperation to cope with COVID-19 is right in the agenda of the national leaders. And then at the grassroots level, people from cities or provinces can translate into the actual projects of fighting COVID-19. Production perspective, I think cities can find partners either that are either producing similar or rather in the different cases, different type of product, and the cities, the partnership finding can base on the complementary aspect. So take for example, a city here in South Korea is needing labor, can find partnership with a city elsewhere where labor is more abundant. So the migrant laborers can become a linking point for cities to seek partnership. Same with the relationship where cities can provide production site for the cities that have that host the companies that are needing the sites for overseas investment. And of course, from the third type of the third method of finding cities finding partnership is through the people's connection. So I have mentioned this point, but I just want to make it briefly here that migrants, workers, and tourists can become the agents for linking cities together. So the story, the personal story can be shared and can become the collective understanding. So cities can, through the actual experience of people working, visiting, and marrying, so cities can come together through these actual people. So I think that, in short, I think that if we think of city diplomacy as the bottom-up approach, we would naturally think of sistership relationship, and sistership relationship can be realized through, like I said, administrative, production, and people perspectives. Thank you.
Thank you. Is Jasmine?
네,
Like I said earlier, 37% of married migrants are from ASEAN countries, and over 60% of migrants in Korea have lived in Korea for over a decade. So when we talk about Korea-ASEAN cooperation, I think the role of multicultural families becomes very important. We are talking about the term the new normal, but we are also witnessing paradigm shifts in business and in trade, and also in communication.
이 이주민의 청착 단계에서는 세 가지
When migrants first try to settle, they go through 3 phases. And number 1, they try to adjust. And number 2, after that, they eventually want to return to and contribute to Korean society. And then they look back and also want to contribute to their country of origin. Migrants are operating multiple communities in Korea at the moment, and these communities are quite active. These communities, for instance, their activities are usually confined to the area that they live in. Oftentimes, Koreans perceive migrants as people who need their help, and I think that kind of perception and framework needs to change. because migrants have dwelt in Korea for quite a long period of time, and because they have become socially active, they have established themselves within the Korean society. Therefore, there is a strong linkage between migrants' home countries and Korea. And like I said earlier, there is the solid SNS platform, which is very active amongst migrants in Korea. So, popular SNS platforms in the ASEAN countries are the ones that migrants often utilize. Online dependency will ever increase. So SNS can serve as a very important platform for increasing people-to-people exchanges. When we talk about the new normal, well, what we are doing today is also a good example because we are broadcasting this symposium live through YouTube. And when this kind of thing happens, then the families of migrants living overseas and people around the world and ASEAN people interested in Korea will have important access. And eventually, the migrants living in Korea will play a very important role. Likewise, ever since 2016, the Ministry of Family Affairs has come up with a database for migrants. It is a database that sorts people with linguistic capabilities. Yes, that kind of database is in place. Many married migrants coming to Korea through marriage, are emerging as very important players in Korea, and they continue to talk to us about their children. 50% of the children are preschoolers, but within a decade, these children will become, just as Sung Kim, these children can become Vietnamese Korean diplomats or Cambodian Korean athletes, can they not? So, Koreans of ASEAN origin will become very important figures in Korean society. And I sincerely hope that the migrants in Korea can contribute to the growth and development of both Korea and of ASEAN countries.
감사합니다. 우리 최원객
Yes, thank you. Professor Xiwan Jin and the two last discussants. You have 7 minutes left among the two of you, so could you make it brief? Yes, I will. I would just make 3 points about the New Southern Policy. The continuity of the New Southern Policy. From the beginning, the South Korean government's policy was vis-a-vis ASEAN was criticized for its inconsistency because when the government changes, when there is a power shift or transfer, then the policies will change. So the lack of consistency was a point of criticism and attack. But in the past 30 years, the approach of the South Korean government towards ASEAN has been pretty consistent. So every 5 years, we have a power shift in the South Korean government, and there is a rebranding of diplomatic policies or foreign policies. But if you look at the contents, it has been pretty consistent. And from the ASEAN point of view, you can see the consistency. For example, the mission, the Korean mission to ASEAN, or FTA between Korea and ASEAN. So regardless of the who is in power in Korea, the foreign policies vis-a-vis ASEAN has been pretty consistent. And so this consistency, continuity should continue. It was the Southern policy started in under the Nomuyeon administrationship, and it has survived through the Lee Myung-bak and Park Geun-hye governments. And so I think the concerns about the inconsistency of the new Southern policy does not have much grounds. And so the interests and also the aim and direction of are also quite consistent. So the general direction and the consistency will continue in the future. And secondly, regarding the focus of the overly focused focus on the economy. I am well aware of that criticism that the Korean government is focusing too much on the economy, and it's not a reciprocal relationship. So that is why the current government has been focusing on mutual benefits, reciprocity. So a lot of the projects initiated by the government has been focusing on community building. And the mutually beneficiary and nature, and also the supplementary and complementary nature of the ASEAN-Korean relationship is going on strong. And we are moving, ASEAN countries are moving from labor-intensive to a capital-intensive economy. And so there is a lot of cooperation in that regard. As also in terms of SMEs. And since people are doing all that, so there is human capital like TVET, where ASEAN and Korea are cooperating. So these are the points of emphasis that the South Korean government is very much aware of, and they're putting all that into practice. So I would like to say that the criticism that the new Southern policy is overly commercial or commercially oriented is groundless. And I think, as was pointed out by Professor Jin also, for the ASEAN-Korea people relationship to become a community, people-to-people exchanges should be emphasized so that there is a real sense of community felt by people. So rather than this initiative being led by the central government, it should be the local governments and also the civil society that come together and try to lead this Southern policy. So the people, out of people, peace, and prosperity, people should be at the front and center of this initiative. Not just one-off tourism visits, but also consistent education and training sessions, and also people-to-people exchanges, especially among the young people. And all that will culminate in building up a community. I know that we will not have results in the short term, but in the long run, this is what will really bear heavy fruit. And this would be the path towards real community.
Because we have only 1 minute remaining, please. People have to come together and stay together. Of course, we have done that under the framework of the nation, but oftentimes when there are cities where rivers or lakes run in between, they have become very close and have exchanged to a great deal, even when there were cities of different countries. Professor talked about how Japan had a very bureaucratic approach and a market-centered approach, and how Japan has made ASEAN a production base. And of course, a lot of ODA was provided as well. Nevertheless, I don't think that the Japan-ASEAN relationship was all that good. I think the missing loop was the people-to-people exchanges. So, taking the people-to-people level exchanges is something that the nation cannot take care of on its own. There is much diplomatic conflict, history issues, and oftentimes nations are confined and they're stuck with dealing with those issues. So cities, megacities, and administrative districts should have the right and freedom to engage and exchange with foreign city counterparts. And if intercity relationship is to be facilitated, then immigration control rights should be given to local governments. And police should have more independence on the local level as well. And local governments, well, ambassadors have come to Busan City today, and then they have foundations for promoting exchanges. But if we could set up a separate department or a division in part of diplomacy under the city of Busan, this kind of institutional effort would be quite desirable. So I hope we can be more creative and proactive in coming up with visions for the future. Thank you very much. Thank you very much for your comments. Because we have now run out of time, let me wrap up. The city of Busan, under the new Southern policy and the grand Southeast Asia policy, Busan has to become a very important part of them, and it can be an important part of them. And I hope a lot of people have talked about civil society level cooperation and its importance. In talking about city to city or citizen level exchanges, what becomes very important is that it has to be an elevated level of cooperation, a mature cooperation and exchange. We want to see ASEAN citizens have a very good image of Korea and Busan City. And I thank the Hankyoreh Peace Research Institute for this session on city diplomacy and city level exchange. Thank you very much for your attention.
Yes, thank you very much. Moving beyond just economic or commercially oriented relationship between Korea and ASEAN, there has to be more people-to-people exchanges and more deepening and expanding of the Korea-ASEAN relations. So in that regard, I think it was a very meaningful discussion. So thank you very much to the moderator and the panelists. Please give them a big round of applause. And we will now take a 20-minute break. Please enjoy the coffee and tea available outside in the lobby. And I'll meet you again here in 20 minutes' time. Thank you.